mysterious roads. In the middle of the night, you hear howlings from either side of the forest. The noises you hear can only be described as mysteriously unexplainable. Thank you everybody for joining me for Mysteriously Unexplainable. This is technically not the very first time I've done this, but it is the most recent time I've done this. And if this is your first time listening to Mysteriously Unexplainable, I'm your host Donnie the Chilimancer, and I'll be sharing with you tonight some stories from one of my favorite books in the entire world, a compendium of mysteries, compiled by the editors over at Reader's Digest back in what I can only assume is the 80s. The book came out for the first time in 1982, featuring stories from subjects such as Beyond the Wall of Time, Unearthly Fates, monsters, and more. Everything from the unquiet sky to the realm of miracles was covered in this book. I'm going to be telling you some of those stories tonight on Mysteriously Unexplainable. Alright, the first thing I want to talk about tonight is the prophecies of Nostradamus. I get some good music going here and we'll snuggle in for these amazing stories. If you haven't grabbed a drink, go ahead, pull the curtains close, grab a drink, maybe some cheese, a nice snack, and we'll get started. The most famous of all non-biblical prophets, Michel de Nostradam, or Nostradamus, was born in Saint-Rémy in the south of France in 1503. He first became famous for his medical work with victims of the plague that broke out in Alsace province in Lyon in 1546 and 47, and only after this began making prophecies. His first collection was published in an almanac of weather predictions in 1550, and in 1555 he published the first 10 collections of prophecies, almost 1,000 in all. Under the title of Centuries, Nostradamus died at Salon in southern France in 1566. Nostradamus wrote his prophecies in verse, for the most part in a highly symbolic style. This and the fact that he chose not to arrange them in any particular order makes their interpretation in many cases a matter of conjecture. Nonetheless, a number of the prophecies do seem to point rather clearly to events that had not yet occurred when Centuries appeared. The first prophecy to bring Nostradamus fame as a seer was the following. the young lion will overcome the older one in a field of combat in a single fight. He will pierce his eyes in their golden cage, 2 wounds in one, then he dies a cruel death. 4 years later, in July 1559, King Henry II of France, who sometimes used the lion as his emblem, engaged in a jousting contest. The lance of his young opponent pierced the king's gilded helmet and wounded him. Henry died after prolonged agony. Few of Nostradamus' prophecies contain anything so precise as a date or even a partial date, but he seems to have given one for the Great Fire of London in 1666, saying it would occur in 3 times 20 plus 6. Most of Nostradamus' prophecies concern large-scale political movements and the affairs of the high and mighty. The French Revolution seems to be the subject of several verses, including this. From the enslaved populace, songs, chants, and demands, while princes and lords are held captive in prisons. These will, in the future, be received by headless idiots as divine prayers. The first sentence is straightforward. The headless idiots of the second sentence are thought to refer to the early leaders of the revolution who perceived the demands of the French populace as prayers, and who, ultimately corrupted by their new power, were themselves overthrown and guillotined. In a letter to King Henry II, Nostradamus also predicted 1792 as a key date in the affairs of the state. In September of that year, at the culmination of the revolution, France was declared a republic. The deaths of Queen Marie Antoinette and Madame du Barry, a mistress of Louis XVI, also appear to have been forecast by this remarkable seer. Like most prophets, Nostradamus seems to have had a particular talent for predicting disasters and falls from power. He's held to have described the fate of Napoleon, whose rule over the French Empire ended with his imprisonment on the tiny island of St. Helena in 1815, and to have predicted the abdication of King Edward VIII of Great Britain in 1936. In 2 quatrains, Nostradamus came close to naming Adolf Hitler and described his calamitous activities with some accuracy. According to the first one, "Liberty shall not be recovered. A black, fierce, villainous, evil man shall occupy it. When the ties of his alliance are wrought, Venice shall be vexed by Hister." The second quatrain was even more vivid. "Beasts, wild with hunger, will cross the rivers. The greater part of the battlefield will be against Hister. He will drag the leader in a cage of iron when the child of Germany observes no law." In content, the verses are remarkably apt. Liberty was seized or occupied by an evil, black-hearted, and black-haired man. Venice, along with the rest of Italy, was indeed eventually vexed by her former ally. Hitler's troops did cross rivers and other boundaries like ravening beasts, even though the majority of countries were against them. The last sentence is unclear but may refer to the German naval blockade of Britain, which before Pearl Harbor was the lone leader of the free world's battle for survival. That's an excerpt from Erica Cheatham, The Prophecies of Nostradamus. Thank you guys for joining me. This is Mysteriously Unexplainable. I'll be playing some mood music tonight. and we'll be talking together about some of the most interesting subjects in the entire world. The next excerpt that I'm going to read is from a section of the book called Dimensions of Time. Time travel has always really interested me. I think that as a kid, I read a whole lot about time and time travel and black holes and space. And I always thought it would be amazing if I was Marty McFly in a DeLorean just flying down the road, waiting to hit 88 miles an hour to go anywhere that I wanted to go. That time has many dimensions is a concept often advanced to account for prophecy. The gist of the idea is that time, which seems to unfold in a linear way, with the past coming before the present and the present before the future, might, in another dimension, not be experienced sequentially. The past, present, and future could in fact exist simultaneously. The concept that there are unfamiliar dimensions of time is most easily approached by way of those dimensions which we are already familiar, those of length, height, and breadth. These, in turn, are best approached, quite literally, from a starting point, which, geometrically speaking, has a location, but no dimensions. It does, however, relate to figures with dimensions in the following way. If a point is moved through space, it marks a line with the one dimension of length. If a line is moved through space, it traces the figure of a plane with the two dimensions of length and breadth. And if a plane is moved through space, it traces a figure with the three dimensions of length, breadth, and height. You can also work backwards from a three-dimensional body and find that the cross-section of the three-dimensional cube is a two-dimensional plane, and the cross-section of the plane is a one-dimensional line, and that the cross-section of the line is a dimensionless point. From this, we can infer that a body of 3 dimensions is the cross-section of a body of 4 dimensions, and that a 3-dimensional body, when moved in a certain way, will produce a body of 4 dimensions. Then comes the question of what sort of body could a 3-dimensional shape be the cross-section? And in what sort of new direction could a 3-dimensional shape be moved to produce one of 4 dimensions, since a movement other than up and down, backwards and forwards, or side to side, would simply produce a larger figure, not one of a different dimension? The answer, of course, is the feature duration, for as soon as something ceases to endure, it ceases to exist. To the 3-dimensional familiar dimensions, then we should add duration in time as a 4th dimension. Ordinary 3-dimensional bodies should therefore be properly described as 4-dimensional, and a body with 3 dimensions must be defined as having only length, breadth, and height, but no duration. Is such a thing possible? It is, but only hypothetically. For in fact, the point, line, and plane do not truly exist as such. Any line that can be seen as a breadth as well as length, just as any physical plane has a certain thickness as well as length and breadth. What movement, then, must a figure of 3 dimensions undergo to produce a body of 4 dimensions? We moved a plane in the dimension of height to produce a cube. So the movement of a hypothetical cube in the dimension of time should produce a real figure of 4 dimensions. What does this movement in the dimension of time mean? As we said, it must mean movement in a new direction, not up, down, or sideways. Are there any other kinds of movement? For a start, there is the movement that the Earth's rotation imparts to everything upon it, that puts even apparently motionless objects in motion. We can thus say that a three-dimensional body is the hypothetically motionless cross-section of a real body whose fourth dimension, duration, is inseparable from the notion and the motion that the turning world inevitably imparts to everything. Further inevitable motions are that of the Earth around the Sun, of the Sun around the center of the galaxy, and perhaps of the galaxy itself around some unknown point. Since any perceptible body is in fact undergoing all of these motions simultaneously, we can say that everything has these dimensions, though in a way that's ordinarily imperceptible, because motions in the dimensions that they imply are only perceptible in a framework of time. They can be referred to as dimensions of time. If duration is one aspect of time, what might the others be? Among several possibilities we can suggest: appearance and disappearance, change and recurrence. Of all possibilities, only duration is perceptible. When we say that something appears, we mean that we suddenly note its existence. When something disappears, we note its lack of existence. We perceive no intermediate condition of appearing or disappearing. In the same way, we talk of change, but actually only develop the concept as we perceive aggregates of characteristics that exist or cease to exist. And so we infer but do not observe the recurrence of sunset and sunrise, passage of seasons, and the growth of a child. And yet, things really do appear and disappear, change and recur. Although not actually perceived to do so, they are, so to speak, hypothetical to us, and they must have their reality in other dimensions of time, just as the hypothetical three-dimensional body becomes real, that is perceptible in the dimension of time we call duration. If access to higher dimensions of time belongs to one body, it's at least theoretically possible that it belongs, though invisibly, to all bodies. We can further assume that such access is by way of unfamiliar modes or levels of consciousness, and that the name we give to one of these is prophecy. This book is so interesting to me. It's like one of my favorites because it's so mysteriously well written. And so in that short period of talking about the different dimensions of time, it also brought up the question, is prophecy caused by a physical dimension of time? Creepiest things I've ever heard of in my entire life is the notion that somebody could be sitting there on their own, minding their own business, without a care in the world, and suddenly just randomly catch fire. The phenomenon is called spontaneous human combustion. and it's not a phenomenon recognized by 20th century science. It's not listed in the International Classification of Diseases compiled by the World Health Organization, nor is it a subject heading to the Index Medicus, the National Library of Medicine's Index of Biomedical Literature. Despite the evidence of police and fire authorities, arson specialists, coroners, pathologists, most doctors and scientists regard seemingly indisputable cases as simply not thoroughly investigated. However, such skepticism's not always prevalent. In the 17th and 18th centuries, spontaneous combustion, especially of drunkards, was regarded as divine retribution. But by the 19th century, advances in biology and chemistry encouraged researchers to look for more mundane causes for these seemingly inexplicable fires. A number of additional possibilities were suggested that might, alone or in various combinations, account for such bizarre occurrences. So these are some of these excuses that they came up with for spontaneous human combustion. This is the rationalization, if you will. Things like intestinal gases are flammable. Cadavers produce gases that are flammable. Haystacks and compost heaps can build up enough heat for spontaneous combustion. Certain elements and compounds spontaneously burst into flames when exposed to air. This is true of phosphorus, for example, which is a constituent of the human body. Some chemicals that are inert alone combine to form explosive compounds. The luminescence emitted by certain insects and fishes proves the possibility of an internal fire of some kind. Fats and oils, which the human body contains in abundance, are excellent fuels. Static electricity produces sparks that could, under certain conditions, set a body on fire. Mounting evidence indicated, however, that none of these hypotheses could really account for spontaneous human combustion. In 1851, a German chemist pointed out that overweight imbibers of brandy generally do not burn when they're close to a fire. Toward the end of the 1800s, several doctors said it was difficult to comprehend how the body, which has a high water content and relatively little fat, could combust. Finally, the April 22, 1905 issue of American Medicine dealt a harsh blow to the believers, noting, of the total number of cases published, nearly half have been reported from the neurotic land of France. Wow, that's amazing. That's hilarious. American Medicine, April 22nd, 1905. Called France neurotic. That would not fly these days. To test the theory that alcohol renders the body highly combustible, a rat was soaked in alcohol for a year, then set on fire. The skin blazed up fiercely, charring some outer layers of flesh, but the rat's internal tissues and organs were hardly unaffected. The experiment was repeated on museum specimens that had been immersed in alcohol for even longer periods. The results were the same. It may be possible for flammable gases produced by digestion to accumulate in the body and present a hazard. An English pastor with such a condition was once warned not to blow out the altar candles following church services for fear his breath might be ignited. Static electricity seems a good candidate for starting these fires, no matter what the fuel might be for them afterwards. The human body can, according to the Fire Protection Manual of the National Fire Protection Association, accumulate a static charge of several thousand volts. Some people have been known to build up far greater charges, occasionally generating up to 30,000 volts. Ordinarily, this electricity is harmlessly discharged through the hair, but in certain volatile situations, such as factories for combustible materials or hospital operating rooms using gaseous anesthetics, these people can spark off explosions. But these explosions have never been known to burn one person to ashes, leaving the room and furnishings unaffected. A number of other physical causes for spontaneous combustion might have been suggested, including fireballs, lightning, internal atomic explosions, laser beams, microwave radiation, high-frequency sound, and geomagnetic flux, but the mechanisms through which any of these might work are unexplained. And for now, so is spontaneous human combustion. Bigfoot has been noted to be on pretty much every single continent on the planet Earth. And these things go by a lot of different names. They go by the Yeti, they go by the Bigfoot, the Grassman, the Skunk Ape, and, a whole bunch of other ones too, I'm sure. But, let's talk about the abominable one. If I can find where my story went. Since the sensational term abominable snowman burst upon a startled and delighted world, it's become clear that it's not just one big hairy upright hominid hunting the wild places, but a varied and widespread clan of them. As reports of sightings accumulate, it seems that there may be 3 distinct types of Yeti in the Tibetan Himalayan area: small, large, and extra large. All or none of which may be related. Only the large one seems to have any relationship to Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the skunk ape of the Everglades, Momo, the Missouri monster, and other American varieties. The Chinese ape man bears a strong resemblance to this group, but the Russian Kaptar seems to be in a class by itself. Are these different geographic races of the same species, or several different types with nothing in common but an upright stance and a lot of hair? Indeed, how do they compare? John Green, the famous Sasquatch hunter, takes a stab at answering. In very approximate terms, the North American variety is a good deal larger than the others, while the Russian one is taller than the Himalayan, but perhaps not heavier. The Himalayan creature, on the evidence of both his description and his footprints, it's entirely unlike a human. The Russian variety, on the other hand, may be very human indeed. For the benefit of those who fear that the killing of a Bigfoot for study would constitute not only murder, but the elimination of a rare creature, Green adds firmly that there's not the slightest possibility that Sasquatches could be considered human or near human. Neither are they an endangered species. He believes that they're numerous. With a few suspect exceptions, Bigfoot is a gentle giant, unduly monsterized by people who cannot conceive of it as a member of the animal kingdom. The Yeti has also been sensationalized out of all proportion to reality. To the Sherpas, there's nothing mysterious about it. The creature has been part of their lives and recollections for at least 200 years. Himalayan villagers and hunters include it as just another animal while discussing local fauna. If it seems elusive, it's because its habitat lies far out of human paths. Himalayan hunters say that the Yeti is not a man, nor does it live in the snow zone. Its home is in the highest Himalayan forests, deep and almost impenetrable thickets. There, it repeatedly moves around on all fours or swings from tree to tree. When it ventures into the snow area where mountaineers may glimpse it or its tracks, it walks upright with a rolling gait. The Sherpas suggest that its reason for crossing the snowfields is to seek a saline moss that grows on the rocks of moraines. Ivan Sanderson says that it's not the moss that they seek, but lichens, which are rich in food value. The American creature seems to be slightly more gregarious and considerably more inquisitive than its Asian counterpart, but it too seems to enjoy a reclusive lifestyle. Skeptics may wonder how it is that so large and supposedly common an animal is able to elude researchers with such ease. In reply, Peter Byrne, founder of the International Wildlife Conservation Society, points out that much of the 125,000 square miles of Sasquatch territory in the Pacific Northwest is heavily forested mountain with few roads, a sparse human population, and almost no visitors. There's plenty of room in this kind of biological sanctuary for Sasquatches and other retiring creatures to live in peaceful, unthreatened isolation. The question of identity remains. Living in impenetrable woods appears to be characteristic of the larger, hairy, upright creatures everywhere, and suggests that there may be evolutionary dropouts seeking refuge from an inimical world. If a few zeuglodons and plesiosaurs have slipped through the net of time, perhaps the two-legged enigmas are relicted too. Bernard Heuvelman suggests that the wild men of Asia may be leftovers of the race of the Pithecanthropus, which occupied Southeast Asia at the end of the Pliocene period, particularly the larger specimens of the ancient ape man group called Pithecanthropus robustus and Meganthropus javanicus. Even pygmy varieties of the species may have survived, accounting for the smaller, unidentified ape-like creatures that are occasionally seen. Zhu Gujing of the Peking Museum of Natural History speculates that the ape-like animals seen in and near Hubei province in 1970s might have been descendants of Meganthropus, a giant ape-man that died out because it lacked sufficient intelligence to adapt to its environment. Other ancients are equally likely contenders. In 1935, Dutch paleontologist Ralph von Koningswald unearthed a collection of fossil teeth of Asian origin that were virtually identical to human teeth, but 6 times larger. He decided that the specimens must have come from a species of giant ape, probably extinct for 500,000 years, which he called Gigantopithecus. But Gigantopithecus may not be extinct. Zoologist Edward Cronin suggests that during the Pleistocene age, Asian Gigantopithecus sought safety from Homo erectus in the almost inaccessible valleys of the Himalayas, and the relatives of the giant ape, distant or near, may have found sanctuary in the still unexplored vastnesses of the New World. So basically, the Bigfoot is still out there. Butt Burns, are you still watching? Mysteriously Unexplainable. This is a spooky show where I talk about some of the spookiest stories in all of the world. If you've studied the occult at all, you might have come across the next topic: creatures of the mind. Creatures of the mind exist in a variety of forms. there's that remarkable population of lifelike entities that inhabits the world of dreams. And there are convincing make-believe playmates, sometimes of long duration, that many children create for themselves. This is not to mention the reported menagerie of visions induced by drugs and alcohol. These manifestations are all subjective and not perceived by others. There are, however, apparitions that make public appearances. Some of these are said to be the perceptible double, the etheric counterpart of a living person who's undergoing an out-of-the-body experience. Even more mysterious are the externalized, perceptible manifestations of something whose existence originated in the mind of its creator by virtue of that person's incredible powers of concentration. In Tibet, where such things are practiced, a ghost of this kind is called a tulpa. A tulpa is usually produced by a skilled magician or a yogi, although in some cases it's said to arise from the collective imagination of superstitious villagers, say, or of travelers passing through some sinister tract of country. A tulpa, the Tibetans claim, may sometimes be so vigorous as to produce its own secondary emanation, known as a young tool, and this may in turn produce an emanation of a third degree, a nyingtul. Adepts able to originate such multiple manifestations are rare and are usually found among the Buddhist saints or bodhisattvas. Some are able to produce 10 different kinds of tulpas. These include apparently animate beings, whether human, animal, or supernatural, and those emanations that appear in the dreams of whoever the bodhisattva intends to help. Few Westerners have had an opportunity to investigate the apparently fanciful Tibetan claims outlined above. One who did was the French scholar and traveler Alexandre David Neal, who spent 14 years in Tibet and studied the doctrines of Tantric Buddhism with a number of eminent lamas. The only woman lama at the time, she was widely honored for her contribution to the understanding of Tibetan thought. Later, she published 2 accounts of her experiences in that remote and little-known country. The following description of her own experience with a tulpa is taken from her book, Magic and the Mystery of Tibet. Besides having few opportunities of seeing thought forms, my habitual incredulity led me to make experiments for myself, and my efforts were attended with some success. I chose for my experiment a most insignificant character, a monk, short and fat, of an innocent and jolly type. I shut myself in Tsam's meditative seclusion and proceeded to perform the prescribed concentration of thought and other rites. After a few months, the phantom monk was formed. His form grew gradually fixed and lifelike looking. He became a kind of a guest, living in my apartment. I then broke my seclusion and started for a tour with my servants and tents. The monk included himself in my party. Though I lived in the open, riding on horseback for miles each day, the illusion persisted. I saw the fat novice monk. Now and then it was not necessary for me to think of him or to make him appear. The phantom performed various actions of the kind that are natural for travelers and that I had not commanded. For instance, he walked, he stopped, he'd look around him. The illusion was mostly visual, but sometimes I felt as if a robe was lightly rubbing against me, and once a hand seemed to touch my shoulder. The features which I had imagined when building my phantom gradually underwent a change. The fat, chubby-cheeked fellow grew leaner. His face assumed a vaguely mocking, sly, and malignant look. He became more troublesome and bold. In brief, he escaped my control. Once, a herdsman who brought me a present of butter saw the tulpa in my tent and took it for a live llama. I ought to have let the phenomenon follow its course, but the presence of that unwanted companion began to prove trying to my nerves. It turned into a day nightmare. Moreover, I was going to Lhasa, so I decided to dissolve the phantom. I succeeded, but only after 6 months of hard struggle. My mind creature was tenacious of life. The White River at Newport, Arkansas was the scene of several sightings in the 1970s. On July 28, 1971, Hoyce Warren of the White River Lumber Company went fishing with 2 friends. Mooring their boat just south of the White River Bridge, they cast their lines. Suddenly, the 3 men were astounded to see a huge column of water belching skyward from a point about 200 feet away. I didn't know what was happening, Warren later told reporters. The giant form rose to the surface and began moving in the middle of the water, away from the boat. It was very long and gray-colored. We'd taken a little Polaroid swinger camera with us to take pictures of the fish we caught. I grabbed the camera and managed to get a picture right before it submerged. It appeared to have a spiny backbone that stretched for 30 or more feet. It was hard to make out exactly what the front portion looked like, but it was awfully large. The Newport Daily Independent published the picture 2 days later. The White River monster, seen in the distance, was slightly blurred around the edges, but appeared to be a large creature, as yet unidentified. Russian lake monsters were in the news again in the 1970s. Hearing tales of a huge water snake in the Jambul region of the Soviet Republic of Kazakhstan in Central Asia, geographer Anatoly Pechersky and his son Volodya spent their 1975 vacation beside the Lake Kokol in that area. One day, while Pechersky and his son were out on the shore, the surface of the lake, about 20 feet, broke up into deep ripples, and a snake-like monster reared up through the churning water. Its massive head was about 6 feet long, and its thick, serpentine body was, by Pechersky's estimate, 50 feet long. Terrified, Pechersky called a warning to his son and scrambled up a steep embankment to get his gun. The monster was still in view by the time father and son returned to the shore, but within moments it began to submerge. As it sank and the water swirled over it, Pechersky realized he could have easily picked up either the still camera or the movie camera instead of his gun. a Sydney surveyor named Charles Harper encamped with several companions on Curragh Mountain in New South Wales, Australia, and had an unnerving experience one night in 1912. Disturbed by sounds from the nearby woods, the men threw extra branches on their fire, and the circle of flickering light enlarged to include a monstrous stranger. As Harper subsequently told the press, a huge man-like animal stood erect not 20 yards from the fire, growling and thumping his breast with his huge hand-like paws. I looked around and saw one of my companions had fainted. He remained unconscious for some hours. The creature stood in one position for some time. I should say its height, when standing erect, would be 5 feet 8 inches to 5 feet 10 inches. His body, legs, and arms were covered with long brownish red hair, which shook with every quivering movement of its body. Mr. Harper hastened from the territory that he thought that it was a gorilla, but there's no Australian gorilla. There does seem to be a 2-legged hairy beast or a wild man, locally known as the yowie. Have you seen the yowie in the middle of Australia? If you've seen the yowie, I want to hear what your experience has been. Go ahead in the comments section and leave your experience for Mysteriously Unexplainable. American miners underwent a harrowing ordeal in Ape Canyon on the east side of Mount St. Helens in the state of Washington. In 1924, Fred Beck and several fellow prospectors noticed huge footprints around their cabin from time to time, and they were puzzled by them. Then one day they saw a large ape-like creature watching them from behind a tree. One miner fired at it, and the thing ran off, apparently wounded in the head. Next, Fred Beck spotted another creature. Where I was. We're going to try this again. American miners underwent a harrowing ordeal in Ape Canyon on the east side of Mount St. Helens in the state of Washington. In 1924, Fred Beck and several fellow prospectors noticed huge footprints around their cabin from time to time, and they were puzzled by them. Then one day they saw a large ape-like creature watching from behind a tree. One miner fired at it and the thing ran off, apparently wounded in the head. Next, Fred Beck spotted another creature standing by the edge of the canyon wall, and he shot it in the back. It fell off the cliff and was lost to view. That night, at least 2 creatures attacked the cabin, battering at the roof and walls in an attempt to break in. A strip of wood was gouged out from between the logs of the cabins, and the men heard thumps on the roof that sounded like the blows of large rocks. But the cabin was sturdily built to withstand heavy snowfalls and windowless, and the door braced from the inside. The creatures were unable to force their way in. Neither were they frightened off by gunshots. About 5 hours later, when the dawn was approaching, the frustrated callers went away, leaving a muddle of big footprints around the cabin. The miners also left, abandoning both their cabin and the mine. A creature of this type was to become known in the United States and Canada as Bigfoot or Sasquatch. That's a Sasquatch story from 1924. It's kind of spooky. This next portion's called A Visitor in the Night. Stationed in Asia on a U.S. government assignment during 1960 and 61, Mr. and Mrs. John Church spent their vacation in India. It was while they were in New Delhi, staying in the splendid old Imperial Hotel, related Miss Church, that she experienced the following. One night I awoke from a sound sleep on hearing my brother David call my name. At the time, he was living in Goshen, New York, where he operated a charter air service. Opening my eyes, I found him standing a few feet away near the coffee table. There was enough light so that I could see him quite distinctly, and I noted that he was wearing his pilot's uniform. Curiously, though, his face was blank, lacking any features. Checking to make sure I was awake and not dreaming, I pinched myself. I identified my surroundings and touched my husband at my side. All the time I stared at my brother. There was no doubt about it. He was there in the room. I was shaken, but I wasn't frightened, and I wondered whether to speak. After a moment or two, his figure wavered, and then it slowly dissolved into vapor, from the head downward until it finally vanished. For the next several weeks, we waited uneasily for mail from my family. Happily, there was no bad news. Upon my return to the States a year later, I related my experience to my brother, and he recalled a terrifying flight the previous year when he thought he was going to die. Both engines of his twin-engine aircraft had failed, but as the plane plunged, one engine miraculously started up again. Although we were unable to synchronize the two experiences exactly, we found they occurred very close in time. What do you think? Have you ever had a scary, harrowing experience that you just can't explain? Maybe a friend or relative has come to you in an out-of-body experience. Maybe somebody's traveled into your dreamscape before, causing you to have a blur between reality and the reality of sleep. I want to hear your stories. Go ahead and tell me in the comments section, and go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Not all curses take place in primitive places. The following events for example, occurred in Oklahoma in 1960. The case involved a man who had been raised by a very domineering mother. When he decided to open a nightclub, she helped him finance it and then stayed on to assist with the management. Some 14 years later, at age 38, he married and soon after decided to sell the club. His mother warned that if he sold out, something dire will happen to you. 2 days after her threat, the man, with no prior history of respiratory trouble of any kind, began to experience a mild attack of asthma. Nevertheless, he went ahead and sold the club. The day after the transaction, he called his mother to tell her about it. She once again told him that something will strike you. His asthmatic condition worsened at once, and he was rushed to the hospital. A psychiatrist was able to help him see the link between his illness and his mother's warnings, and the asthmatic condition began to subside. Feeling better, the man began plans for another business, this time without his mother. Then one day he called to tell her about it. She didn't try to dissuade him, but told him to expect more dire results if he persisted. Within an hour of the fateful phone call, he had another attack of asthma and died. Mysteriously unexplainable. It's been estimated that in the United States today, about 10 million persons are reported missing during the course of a single year. About 95% of them returned home within hours or days, but the remaining 5% vanish forever. teenagers constitute the largest group of vanishees. Gravitating to large cities, they're usually swallowed up by a sordid underworld. Among missing adults is an increasingly percentage of them are women. An interesting aspect of women's. A tracer study has shown that in 1960, about 300 times more husbands vanished than wives, while in 1980, as many wives as husbands whisked themselves away. It's not easy to disappear without a trace, but it's a common occurrence. On the pages that follow are the accounts of many people who have done so. They have all the ingredients of a good mystery story, except for the ending, which in these cases is left to speculation. The circumstances surrounding these disappearances are bizarre and sometimes ridiculous, and the ways in which they vanish without a trace, from a train, a ship, or an airplane, or while crossing a street or a field, are inexplicable. We're intrigued by the possible motives, the dictates of the heart, the overriding wish to escape from a monotonous existence or unwanted responsibilities, the lures of adventure and wealth, a compromised career, political intrigue, murky connections with criminals, and the attendant perils of knowing too much. Reading, we ponder the difficulty of disappearing and leaving no trail, of abandoning old pursuits, cutting ties, and assuming new identities. And we contemplate the dark fates of those unaccountably lost on their quest for adventure and discovery. We also imagine the families whose lives are tragically affected by the loss of a relative, the gnawing uncertainties, the apprehension, the gray area of guilt, the longing for an explanation that will never be made. Still rarer and perhaps stronger than the stories of those who have vanished into a chasm of the unknown are the documented cases of people who have appeared out of nowhere and whose identities remain forever a mystery. Some may be long-lost amnesiacs, others may be the wild children who have prompted so much speculation about the nature of human nature. The idea of someone who disappears into oblivion, or one who has no past, is difficult to contemplate, especially today when each person is documented by a string of records, certificates, and ID cards from the hour of birth to the moment of death. In 1809, England sought to persuade Austria to join the Confederation opposing Napoleon. Benjamin Bathurst, a 25-year-old diplomat who'd already distinguished himself in foreign service, went to Vienna to promise an attack on the French, who were occupying Spain, in return for Austria's alignment with England. It proved a bad bargain. Napoleon was victorious at Wagram on the Danube River, and Austria was formed to cede territory to him. That fall, Bathurst began to make his way back home through Germany. On November 25th, traveling under the name of Coke and posing as a wealthy individual, he and his secretary and valet stopped at an inn in Perlberg. A witness at the inn reported that he seemed very nervous. He asked the commander of the local garrison to provide armed guard against mysterious pursuers, perhaps agents of Napoleon. In the middle of the evening, as his coach was preparing to leave, Bathurst went into the otherwise deserted street, walked around his horses, and was gone. His valet, who had been at the rear of the coach with the baggage, cast a look down on each side of the coach and saw only the hostler who had harnessed the horses. His secretary, standing on the doorway of the inn to pay the bill, had not seen him return. The soldiers stationed at the end of each street hadn't seen anyone pass. The authorities searched for the inn and then all of Pearlburg. Inquiries from the British Foreign Office brought a denial from Napoleon that his agents had been involved. Stories circulated that Bathurst had been robbed and murdered, that he had secretly gone on to a port and been lost at sea, and so on, but all that is known about Benjamin Bathurst's disappearance from a quiet street in a small German town is summed up in the words of Charles Fort, the tireless collector of events that has no rhyme or reason. Under observation, he walked around to the other side of the horses. "3 suns and 21 planets freaks most out. I haven't heard of that. I'm very interested, though." Alright, I've been on here for about an hour tonight. I do want to say thank you guys for joining me for the very first Mysteriously Unexplainable. I've had a lot of fun reading these stories to you. Next time I'm going to bring something to drink because I have a very dry mouth and throat. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you're notified whenever I go live. I'm almost to 1,000. And that means I can go live mobile and show you more of Offbeat, Ohio. This is Donnie the Chilimancer. Thank you for joining me in an excursion into the mysteriously unexplainable.